This is the homework for 133, 134, and 135. For problem 133A, we have a series of diamond problems. And remember, the bottom part of the diamond is the sum of these two numbers, and the top is the product of these two numbers. 6 plus 11 is 17. 6 multiplied by 11 is 66. For B, we have -1 plus 4. You have more positives than negatives. Keep the sign that you have more of, and then subtract. 4 minus 1 is 3. -1 multiplied by 4 is -4, because a negative multiplied by a positive is a negative. Problem C. -3 plus -2 is -5. I call these digs. I dig down 3 feet, and then I dig down 2 more feet. I'm down a total of 5 feet, so -5. -3 multiplied by -2 is a positive 6, because a negative multiplied by negative is a positive. In problem D, -1 plus 8, we have more positives than negatives, so you know the sum's going to be a positive. 8 minus 1 is 7. -1 multiplied by +8 is -8. For E, we have the sum of two fractions, 1/2 plus 1/2. And I show that here. We have a common denominator, so you keep the denominator, and you add the numerators. 1 plus 1 is 2. 2 halves equals 1 whole. To multiply these two, 1/2 multiplied by 1/2, you just multiply straight across. The numerator, 1 multiplied by 1 is 1. 2 multiplied by 2 is 4, so you get 1/4. For F, 1/3 plus 3/4, we don't have a common denominator, so you have to find a common denominator. These common denominator for 3 and 4 is 12, and we multiplied 3 by 4 to get 12. So if you multiply the denominator by 4, you multiply the numerator by 4. 1 multiplied by 4 is 4. What did we multiply 4 by to get to 12? 3. So 4 multiplied by 3 is 12. Now we multiply the numerator by 3. 3 multiplied by 3 is 9. Now that we have a common denominator, you keep the denominator. 4 plus 9 is 13, which is an improper fraction. We simplify that to 1 and 1/12. To multiply fractions, you don't need a common denominator. You just multiply the numerators. 1 multiplied by 3 is 3. 3 multiplied by 4 is 12. Simplify 3/4, and you get 1/4. And I could have cross-simplified here and got 1/4. For 133G, we just have two variables, x and x. So the sum of x and x equals 2x. And it looks like here. We have an x plus an x, you have a total of 2 x's. But when you're multiplying variables with the same base, x multiplied by x, you get x squared. Let me show you an example of why that would be. So let's say x equals 5. So we would have, instead of x, we would have 5 multiplied by 5. Well, that's 5 squared. 5 squared is 25. It's not 2 times 5, which equals 10. So there's a big difference. For H, A plus B is just A plus B. We cannot combine these because they're not like terms. So we just keep it in the form of A plus B. And the same of multiplying. A multiplied by B is just AB. For 134A, we're adding integers. And we have -15 plus 7. Well, that equals -8. And I know it's going to equal a negative because we have 15 negatives and only 7 positives. So you keep the sign that you have a greater value. So you have 15 negatives. and only 7 positives. So you have negative, and then you subtract the 2. 15 minus 7 is 8. Another way of looking at it, and this would take a long time, it's a little more difficult with values that are greater than maybe 5, 6. But here I show that negative 15, so I put 15 negatives here, plus 7 positives, and a negative plus a positive equals a 0 pair. So these cancel out. So 0 pair, and so forth. And I'm left with 8 negatives. So if this works for you, use it. Sometimes when you get with the greater values, it's a little more difficult. You wouldn't want to use it if this was negative 95 and put 95 negatives. That would just take too long. So it's better to understand, identify that which has, do you have more negatives or positives? And more negatives, signs are opposite, you subtract the 2. For B, we have 8 minus the quantity of negative 21. Well, this negative here is telling you to take the opposite or the inverse. So what is the opposite of negative 21? Well, it's positive 21. So 8 plus 21 equals 29. For C, 6 multiplied by negative 8. A positive multiplied by a negative is going to equal a negative. So 6 multiplied by negative 8 is negative 48. And remember, for multiplication and division, positive and a positive is a positive. Negative and a negative is a positive. So if the signs are the same, positive. Signs are opposite, negative. And that only works for multiplication and division. Here for D, we have a dig. Negative 9 plus negative 13. Dig down 9 feet and dig down 13 feet. So you're adding these two together and your hole's getting deeper. So you have more negatives, so you know it's a negative since they're both negatives. 9 plus 13 is 22, so negative 22. For E, negative 50 and negative 30 equals negative 80. Another dig. Dig down 50 feet, dig down 30 feet. It's a total of negative 80 feet. For F, 3 minus a negative 9. Well, what's the opposite of a negative 9? Positive 9. So 3 plus 9 equals 12. For G, negative 75 minus, or the opposite of a negative 75. Well, that's a positive 75. So negative 75 plus 75 equals 0. H, negative 3 plus 6. Do you have more negatives or positives? Well, we have 6 negatives and only 6 positives and only 3 negatives. So we know it's going to be a positive. Signs are opposite, so we subtract. 6 minus 3 is a positive 3. For 134I, 9 plus a negative 14. More negatives, so we know the sum is going to be a negative number. Signs are opposite, we subtract. 14 minus 9 is 5, so it's a negative 5. 28 minus a negative 2. The opposite of a negative 2 is a positive 2. So 28 plus 2 equals positive 30. For K, negative 3 plus a negative 2 plus 5. So we have 3 terms here. Negative plus a negative. So we have negative 3 and a negative 2 is a negative 5. Plus 5 equals 0. This is a 0 pair. L, 3 plus 2 is 5. Plus 5 equals 10. For 135, the area of each rectangle below is shown in the middle of the rectangle. So here's the area. For each figure, find the missing length or width. So the length of 8, width, and we don't know. So this is the unknown, so we're going to try to find the width. So here, The area of a rectangle is length multiplied by width. So for area, we know it's 60 inches. For the length is 8, the width is unknown. So now we use inverse operations to isolate this variable to find the width. Well, to get rid of this 8 and bring it over to the other side, we want to do inverse operations. So inverse of multiplication is division. So we're going to divide both sides by 8, and this creates a big 1. 8 divided by 8 is 1, so we're left with 1 on the side. So that cancels out. What you do to one side, you do to the other. 60 divided by 8 is 7.5. So the width equals 7.5 inches. For B, the area equals 180 meters squared. We have a length of 15 meters. So the two given are the area and the length. Area equals 180. The length equals 15. We want to find the width. Here's multiplication. The inverse property of multiplication is division. So we're going to divide both sides by 15. Created a 1. 180 divided by 15 equals 12. So the width of this rectangle equals 12 meters. And if you wanted to check to make sure this is correct, multiply, remember length multiplied by width, so 12 multiplied by 15 should equal 180. If it doesn't, you did something incorrect. For C, we have an area of 231. So remember, area equals length multiplied by width. We have the width this time of 14, and we're trying to find the length. Inverse property of multiplication is division, so we're going to divide this side by 14, created a 1. What you do to one side, you do to the other. 231 divided by 14 equals 16.5. So the length of this rectangle is 16.5 centimeters. And again, to check, multiply 16.5 and 14, and you should get 231.